Okay, welcome to video 3 in the frame series. So in this video, we're going to look at the structural frame. Let me just pull that slide up. Okay, so in this one, we're going to look at the structural frame, which is really all about objective analysis of artwork. So you'll be really familiar with this one. So when we're looking at the structural frame, we're looking at art as a form of visual communication. So that's really the key idea here, is we're looking at how it's communicating, not just what it's communicating, which is obviously the interpretation that you make, but how it is communicating. So the structural frame is about how ideas are represented and how that meaning is communicated in visual arts. We can see through the structural frame that art is a system of communication where meaning is understood by interpreting the visual language of signs, symbols, and codes. I've got a couple of definitions here for you. And depending on your interest in semiotics, you might even like to look these up further. But essentially, a sign is anything that represents an idea and communicates its meaning, like an image or a word. So the word that describes the study of this is semiotics, which is the study of signs as a system of communication. A symbol is obviously a type of sign that viewers have to interpret, and this is done through a process of connotation or culturally understood meanings. And I'm assuming that you understand what is meant by connotation, but if any of these words are unfamiliar to you, please let me know so that I can clarify them for you. But connotation is where we have to apply, symbolic meaning, or we have to apply a culturally understood meaning in order to understand something. So it's the opposite of denotation, which is literal. An example of this is that the word rose, or a red rose, the word red rose means a red flower, but the connotations of a red rose are something like love or romance. A code is a system of signs that are combined to represent more complex ideas. And so things, really basic things like our alphabet is a system of codes that we interpret and understand. So when we're looking at the structural frame, we're looking at the elements and principles of art, as well as materiality. And I'm pretty sure I covered that previously. So the concept of materials being imbued with meaning. And we're looking at the relationship between those elements and principles, the overall composition and the materiality, and the signs and the symbols that exist within the art, and how they all work together to communicate meaning to the viewer. So if we apply the conceptual framework, here's how we might look at the structural frame. So the artist, you or another artist, through the structural frame, uses the visual language of signs, symbols, and codes to represent ideas and communicate meaning. You do this in your own artwork when you choose which symbols that represent elements of your culture. So you're already drawing on this in your own work. And so when you're viewing the work of others, you're looking at what codes are they using, what symbols are they using. And it doesn't have to be cultural. It could be in relation to things like gender. It could be in relation to things like religion. So it could be any kind of symbol that has some sort of meaning. The artwork itself, through the structural frame, we interpret them as symbolic objects that communicate meaning through the use of visual language, including the materials and techniques that represent ideas. And so we can even go as far as to look at how the work is constructed. For example, a really textural painting done in thick impasto paint where, let's say it's of the ocean, and it's done so thickly and the brushstrokes look like waves. They have that textural quality of waves. So we can look at how the techniques are being used to create perhaps a sense of turbulence in that water. If we consider the audience through the structural frame, audiences are able to understand visual language and the signs, symbols, and codes that communicate meaning. So they're actually actively participating in the making of meaning and in the process of interpretation. And obviously interpretations can differ. This is based on culture, age, geographic location, and so on. But essentially you're looking at, are they able to tell that I'm creating a somber mood in this piece because I've used colours that connote that feeling of somberness? And generally speaking, most people do. Depending on how nuanced the layers of meaning are, of course. And then if we consider the world, or the context of the whole world, through the structural frame, the world is understood using visual language, sets of signs, symbols, codes, and conventions that are understood by both artists and their audiences. And again, this is a cultural thing. So I said before about the red rose and the connotations of love, but in another culture, probably a better example is the color white, which in Western culture has associations with things like purity or innocence, peace, whereas in some cultures that's the color for death. So, we have to understand that different cultures will have different interpretations based on their cultural understanding. So, when you're looking at an artwork, or even when you're making an artwork, questions to ask using the structural frame. So, under artist, how has the artist used particular materials or techniques to communicate meaning? Do these materials or techniques have their own meaning? And that comes back to materiality. So, in your own work, what materials or techniques are you using to link to your ideas? And do any of the materials you're using have their own inherent ideas? An example of that is actually my own work, which is currently in porcelain. And I've specifically chosen porcelain because of the connotations of fragility, even though as a clay body, it's actually very, very strong. So I am thinking about how my theme of fragility is inherent in the materials that I'm using. Does the artist belong to a particular art movement, group, or period? And what features of the artwork relate to that style? Now, that's going to be more visible when we're looking at art history, more so than contemporary art. So if you're looking at an artwork from, say, the Impressionist movement, then you're going to be able to identify specific aspects of that movement that are visible in the work. You'll be able to recognize the work. A better example is probably looking at Cubism and the works of Picasso and other Cubists in the late 1940s, because their work is identifiable as belonging to that group. So then we go, well, what are the stylistic aspects of this work that tell me it belongs to that group or that movement? This kid's outside being really loud. If we look at the artwork using the structural frame, what subject matter is in the work and how is it represented? What meanings are usually associated with that subject matter? And this is a really important one to be thinking of when we're doing self-portraiture. We're doing self-sculpture, but how are we representing ourselves? What ideas are we using to represent a sense of self? And secondly, what ideas are represented in the artwork? What signs, symbols, or codes are then used to communicate that meaning? Questions to ask in the structural frame around audiences. So how might audiences read the artwork to reveal its meaning? Are there hidden or layered meanings or nuanced layers of meaning that might only be understood by certain audiences? An example of this could be if an artwork contains religious iconography. You would have to have an understanding of religion and of images to do with religion in order to understand the meaning being created in the work. That can also apply to age as well. Obviously, younger audiences might have different experiences with the world that might affect their ability to make meaning. And it applies especially to postmodern work, and we'll look at the postmodern frame in the next video. But when we're looking at postmodernism and works that use appropriation or parody or pastiche, that layer of meaning relies on contextual or pop cultural knowledge. Questions to ask in the structural frame using the world. What was the word I used to describe these before? I can't remember. How has the world been represented using visual language? So what kind of world is represented in the artwork and how is it represented? And does the artwork refer to other ideas in the art world or from art history? So, what can we learn about the time and the place that's depicted in this artwork? Or what do we know about the time and place that this artwork was created? I've got a task for you to do. So this task is, this is a painting. It's called it's called The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein Hans Holbein the Younger. This was painted all the way back in 1533, and it is oil paint on wood, and it's big. It's over 2 meters by over 2 meters. So find a copy of this online, and you should be printing these to put into your visual diary. Or alternatively, if you have access to a computer, you can find a copy of the image and pop it into a Word document, and you can be doing your note taking in a Word document. So find a copy of this image. The reason this guy's called Hans Holbein the Younger is because there was also Hans Holbein the Older. I think that should be fairly obvious to you. So make sure you find this exact work. And so this painting, The Ambassadors, contains many layers of meaning hidden in the details of the painting. So there's a video I want you to watch, and I'll put a link to the video when I post this on YouTube. Or there's an interactive site. So I'll link to both of those in the notes under the video description. And you can have a look at the video. It goes through some of the hidden layers of meaning and how to read the signs, symbols, and codes in this artwork. And then complete the following activities, obviously in your visual diary, or typed is fine. So I will put a link to that video wherever the links go. Okay, so obviously paste a copy of the artwork, image, and citation into a document or your diary. If you don't have access to a printer, and like I said, a Word document is fine, or you can always sketch the artwork. So if you can't print an artwork to glue into your visual diary, make a sketch of it. You can absolutely do that, and it just can be like a value study. It doesn't have to be really detailed, but a quick sketch of the artwork is totally fine. So here are some questions for you. What can you tell about the two figures in this artwork by considering their clothing, accessories, and the objects they are shown with? So essentially what I want you to do is create like a profile that explains each man's background. Now, this can be done in dot points, that's fine. But what can you learn about the two figures in this artwork based on what you can observe on and around them? What kind of man do you think they are? What kind of life do you think they lead? What do you know about the kind of background they have, or what kind of, are they rich? Are they poor? Are they young? Are they old? Like, what can you tell about them? And have in the back of your mind as well that this artwork was created 500 years ago. So, think about what symbols are applicable to that time period as well. Secondly, identify 3 details in the artwork that the artist has used to communicate symbolic meaning about the time and the place the artwork was made. So 3 symbols, write them down, and then identify and explain how those symbols tell us something about that time and place. So explain the ideas represented by each symbol. Once you've completed that task, can you please either email it through to me if it's typed, or obviously bring it into class. If you're unable to bring it into me, take a photo on your phone and email it to me, because then I can give you some feedback or bring up any considerations or things that you could consider further. I want to talk about this in relation to your own art making, because it's really important to understand that there's a massive overlap between theory and practice in visual arts. So, it's all good and well to do all of the theory, but the theory is not separate to your own art making. So I want you, and I know you have been thinking about this stuff, so I want you to use this task to kind of solidify some of your stuff about your own work. See whether or not you've already answered some of these and what you can add to it. So think about how you would represent yourself or someone you know using symbolic objects. I'm going to add to this as well in a second. So make a list of at least 5 objects you would use and explain how each object uses symbolism to communicate meaning about your chosen subject. So you can do this about yourself, or you can do this about someone close to you. So 5 objects that are symbolic that you would use visually, and then explain what is communicated with that object about that person. Obviously, your final work is going to be a self-sculpture. So, and I'm sure you have already, I know you have already, considered the symbolic elements that you're planning to include and what those elements represent. What I want you to do, there's a couple of things I want you to do here. I want you to make sketches of each of these symbolic elements. So individual drawings. So not just a drawing of your final artwork and how you plan it to look, but the symbolic element that you're including in the artwork. Do some studies of that art, of that symbol or that object. I want you to consider different techniques that could be used to apply that to the surface of the clay. So some of the techniques I suggest you consider include sgraffito and carving. So you have experience with this, but I suggest you go and do some research on sgraffito and carving and the best ways to do it, when to do it, and the effects that you get. Because carving into fresh clay versus carving into leather hard clay, you're going to get very different results. Another one is underglaze image transfer. So it's essentially printmaking on clay. Have a look at that as an option. Is that something you could do? And often that will affect the image in that it will become quite distressed looking rather than very clean. That could be part of the aesthetic that you're going for. You can paint directly onto clay. You can use coloured slips or you can use underglazes. So, using paint or underglaze as paint and applying it in a painterly fashion could be something that you're interested in. Imprinting onto clay, so pressing things into the clay to create what is called a relief print, which is a print that has areas that are sunken and areas that are raised. So you can do this you could carve into lino, for example, and press the lino into the clay. You can press found objects such as leaves or sticks into clay, shells, things like that. And the last one is sculptural, which is raised relief, which is where you actually create sculpted items. And you've done some of this already with like little flowers. So what I want you to do is, first of all, create drawings or studies of different elements that you want to use in your own work. And then I want you to research these techniques and identify the best type of techniques that you would use. I want you to collect images of at least 3 that you could use and write how you would use them in your artwork. And include sketches and drawings with that as well. There was something else I was going to add to that, and I've lost it, so I'll leave it there for now. If you have any questions, like always, please send them through to me. And any images of any work that you've completed, please send that through to me as well. I'll post the next video in the next day or 2. So essentially, do this one across this week, and then the next one will go up, which is the postmodern frame. And then I'll be sending through some more information about comparison and contrast shortly.